Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Singapore Democratic Party's Facebook Live on the Singapore Budget 2020. As you know, the Committee of Supply debate is going on right now in Parliament, but we want to hear from you and we want to speak directly with you about the Singapore budget, about the future. We're not talking about short-term programs, goals, and schemes. What we're talking about is the long-term future for the good of our country. So we have a panel here with Brian Lim, our Treasurer, Julius Kung Wayin, who's our CEC member, and Alfred Tan, local business person. So to kick things off, I'm going to invite Brian to start talking about the cost of living and its impact in the budget in Singapore.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. A very good evening to you, my fellow Singaporeans. Now, in the last 2 weeks, you have witnessed how the PAP's 2020 budget is full of little tweaks and complex schemes, but short on bold moves that are necessary to transform our political economy. It is nothing more than an election budget, which is long on desperation, but short on promise. It does not address the multiple challenges that our country is facing in a changing world. Sadly, the government is missing a crucial window of opportunity to effect much needed reforms. Working and middle income Singaporeans continue to struggle in one of the world's most expensive cities. This makes life tremendously stressful for the average Singaporean. The reality is stark. 85% of Singaporeans have indicated that they don't have enough savings for their retirement. Our younger folks are no better off. 80% of those between the age of 20 to 35 don't have savings. Another study found 6 in 10 Singaporeans don't feel comfortable about their retirement plans. Those in between, the working middle class, the sandwich class that is, also have it bad. Half our households live from paycheck to paycheck. They are one major bill away from financial ruin. This can come in any unforeseen, unpredictable circumstances, such as an accident or an illness. The high cost of living has also seriously affected the total fertility rate, which is at 1.14, is the lowest in Singapore's history. Local couples have repeatedly cited the cost of living as the biggest factor deterring them from having babies. The high cost of living has also affected productivity, our need to transform our workforce into one which is more focused on creativity and innovation. Financial insecurity coupled with an economy dependent on cheap foreign labor is not conducive for such transformation. Now, the SDP has viable alternative solutions to deal with the high cost of living. In fact, our budget proposal ties in with the various policy papers which we have rolled out since our election campaign launch last year. Firstly, the SDP has proposed to cancel plans to increase the GST to 9% even after 2021. Now, if you recall, before the 2015 elections, then Deputy Prime Minister Farman had assured Singaporeans that the government had enough funds for increased spending until 2020. He said that the increased spending planned for the rest of this decade is sufficiently provided for by measures that the government had already taken. We have accumulated a total of $19.1 billion in budget surplus from the year 2016 to the year 2018. Even after we account for the 10.9 billion deficit expected for this financial year, a balance of 8.2 billion still remains. Let's not forget that we have already bloated reserves. Hence, is there a need to raise the GST when the collection is more than what you need? The SDP also proposes to increase the GST for luxury items and remove the GST for basic items instead. We should raise the GST rate for luxury items to 10% or more. Under the current regressive system, a poor old man buying medicine is taxed at the same rate as a wealthy woman buying an LV bag. The SDP also proposes to reinstate estate duty for the super rich, which the PAP has abolished in 2008. The SDP proposes a 30% tax rate with the exemption threshold of 20 million both for citizens and non-citizens. In other words, only properties worth $20 million and more, which are passed down as inheritance, will be taxed. We also like to raise the cap for personal income tax for the top 1% income earners and bring it back up to 28%. This figure is still well below the level of advanced economies, which are typically in the 30 to 40% range. Without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Wai Yin, who will touch on the subject of curbing foreign PMETs. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Hi, good evening. I'm Wai Yin. I am a member of the SDP CEC. Let me share our party's thoughts specifically on the aspect of employment raised in this budget. As Brian has put it, while many of these measures presented in the 2020 budget is good, they are in fact a regurgitation of past practices without bold plans to change the way we do things. One area of change that we feel is sorely lacking is our dependency to foreign workers, especially foreign PMETs. In separate reports from today, one article ran with the headline, about 1,000 firms suspected of discriminatory hiring practices placed on government's watch list. And the other, MOM further tightens foreign workers regime to develop strong local core of skilled workers. These two articles affirm what we know about the unfair hiring practice of some of these companies, which has led to a large congregation of foreigners in certain industries and companies. This has led to the questions of whether our born and bred Singaporeans are lacking in the skill sets required to take up the available jobs. As policymakers, it is our jobs to ensure that such practices do not penalize local employment unfairly. We agree that Singapore as a globalized city-state cannot afford to bar foreign talents from our economy. But the key here is to ensure that we allow true talents into our folds, while not forcing our local workforce into accepting lower pay due to cheap to hire foreigners with similar qualification. While the fair consideration framework is in the right direction, we would like to point to our suggestions in our population policy. In it, we suggested that a candidate to be assessed based on a point system, where we ensure that only foreigners with the right skill sets and competencies which are not available or in short supply to be allowed into Singapore. This will ensure that those hired into our country is helping to elevate our economy by complementing our local workforce, rather than just being low-cost workers. We would also like to reintroduce the idea of a minimum wage across industries, especially those with a large population of foreign workers. This may be blue-collar jobs where many deem to be beneath the aspiration of a local Singaporean. I would like to share an experience I had during my vacation to Australia last year. During my trip, I saw that most of their wait staff, street cleaners, construction workers are all locals. They are perfectly willing and happy to do these demeaning jobs, simply because this job pays them a fair and decent wage to support a dignified lifestyle. The introduction of a minimum wage will ensure that everyone working in Singapore is being paid a living wage. This ensures that we are not exploiting both locals and foreign workers. Another benefit that minimum wage could bring about is a reduction of the widening income inequality. With the poorer segment earning more, we can also look forward to bridging the socio-economic gap between the higher and lower income families. Lastly, with the new proposals by the SDP to ensure that locals are adequately employed and fairly remunerated as proposed in our population policy paper, we would like to call for the PAP to cancel its plan to increase our population to 6.9 million on this island. The economy has improved significantly from years ago, but these are achieved at the expense of workers' income and well-being. We need the PAP to assure the people that the foreign talent curb that is now in place is not a temporary measure. The growth at all costs strategy will not be repeated to the detriment of Singaporeans. We want them to tell the people that they will not import another 1.2 million people, not unless they can clearly demonstrate that such a target will enhance the well-being of Singaporeans. The yesteryears where we blindly import the lowest cost workers has left the country overcrowded with workers with depressed wages, leading to higher anxiety and lower quality of life. This cannot be repeated. We call for the PAP to categorically states that it will not enforce a 10 million population onto this island. With the above observation and suggestion, I will now hand over to my colleague Alfred to share his views with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jairus. We'd like to now address the retirement financial adequacy of Singaporeans. The SDP is disappointed that the government has not taken the opportunity to address and repair the CPF at this time of stress and anxiety. Recent research has suggested that a minimum of $1,379 is required to live adequately during a Singaporean's golden years. Although the latest household expenditure survey indicated that retiree households living in public flats receive an average of $1,522 each month for their retirement needs, only $280 was attributed to CPF payouts. A significant portion of their income was contributed by their children and relatives. This dependence on their working children to support their retirement years places burden upon workers already with children to support. The financial strain on the familial system can be stressful. Now, the original purpose and mission of the CPF was to provide financial adequacy in the golden years of the Singapore citizen. If Singaporeans today cannot retire comfortably with reasonable financial adequacy, then the CPF must have failed its primary purpose. The retirement funding source from the CPF in its current form clearly has not served its primary purpose of ensuring retirement adequacy for Singaporeans. It has not delivered on its mission. It is a failed program. The CPF is a constant reminder to all Singaporeans that the government of this nation has not stood by its promise to fully return the savings of Singaporeans when they reach 55 years old. The Provident Fund was set up as a savings plan for the Singaporean worker, so that when he turns 55 years old, he is able to take out his own savings to fund his golden years, enjoying the fruits of his labor, which are well deserved after having worked so hard and contributed to society. The Provident Fund was to replace the pension system Singapore previously had. However, that promise to return the savings at 55 years old was reneged. Now, back in June 1984, Dr. Toh Chin Chai, chairman of PAP and the Deputy Prime Minister in his earlier years, spoke out on his deep concerns when the government attempted to raise the CPF withdrawal age. He had said in Parliament, "I think fundamental principles are being breached. The CPF is really a fixed deposit or a loan to government, which can be redeemed at a fixed date when the contributor is 55 years old. If I were to put this sum of money in a commercial bank and on due date, I go to the bank to withdraw the money, and the manager said, 'I'm sorry, Dr. Toh, you will have to come next year.' There will be a run on the bank." It is as simple as that the CPF has lost its credibility. That is right. The CPF has lost its credibility. The government has lost its credibility. It has encroached into the purpose of CPF, which is to provide for retirement. Dr. Toh has wisely warned against it. The government ignored him and the people. It changed the nature of the Provident Fund. It added other things into it, allowing it to be used for other purposes. And what is left now is that we have a CPF that does not adequately provide for retirement, the original purpose of the savings plan. And what is the government's response? It demanded that Singaporeans continue to work until they can work no more. The government kept claiming that Singaporeans wanted it. The government laughed about it and said it was good exercise. When one has been enjoying a good thing, it becomes hard to let go, be it food, play, power, or your CPF savings. The government starts to dream up new programs and reasons why Singaporeans must continue to leave their savings in the CPF. The government disrespects Singaporeans when it comes to the savings of the people. It looks down on its own people. It thinks that Singaporeans are idiots when it comes to managing their personal finances. How does the individual adult Singaporean conduct life's business in Singapore? He works. He gets his wages. He spends on the needful for his family or on himself. He saves when he can. He invests when he can. And he does all this through his life. And are you telling me that when he turns 55 years old, he magically becomes senile or lost his ability to continue living and his activities responsibility, which includes allocating his financial resources to his living and future priorities? Who gave the idea that Singaporeans do not know how to manage themselves? Who gave the idea that Singaporeans do not know how to manage funds in their bank savings and fixed deposit accounts? Of course, when we fully withdraw our savings from the CPF, we can opt to leave some of our funds in the RSS if CPF can offer better returns when compared to other available options at that time. The CPF board have to work hard to prove their performance. You want our savings, you work for it. You don't compulsorily force it. The people can have a choice. The people have the freedom to choose and make a decision about their own savings. Singaporeans can think. They can manage their monies. They have been doing this all their lives. Of course, a responsible government can provide further financial counseling and education prior to the withdrawal at 55. This can only further benefit the people of Singapore. So are Singaporeans financially adequate and ready for their retirements? Or do they have to endlessly slog away and continuously work to earn their keep right to their deathbeds, or until they are of no more use as an economic cog in the PAP's vision of a nation? Whether we choose a provident fund or a retirement endowment plan to provide for ourselves a decent purse to fund our golden years, the chosen form must serve its purpose and deliver on its objectives. There are many, many examples of schemes around the world to analyze and learn from. So let us not be too prideful and complacent and think that the CPF is the gold standard that the world should admire and emulate. Let's get back to the basics. Our government has a knack to overcomplicate things and often get itself entangled with the peripherals. Let's get to the core. Our retirement plans should ensure that we have adequate funds when we stop working. If you allow the CPF to be used to pay for highly priced HDB flats, how then are you going to have sufficient cash left to fund your retirement? Sell the roof over your family's heads just when you're supposed to sit back, smell the roses and enjoy the fruits of your labor? And with the wild swings in property prices, are you sure the acquired property will not drop in value and hence affect the cash you can get back when you sell it? The CPF is a savings account that is meant to finance our retirement years. It is not for speculation on property purchases that is subject to market swings. Don't mix up your future retirement funding and be seduced by that pot of gold at the end of 55 years old to bail you out. It is certainly not a coincidence to see how high property prices have soared since the government announced the CPF Residential Property Scheme regulations in June of 1981, which permitted CPF funds to be used for property purchases. Singaporeans threw caution to the wind and mindlessly purchased the biggest HDB flats their prevailing income would allow, having little thought on future earning capacities or the future depreciating value of the underlying asset. The government must have the well-being of its citizens. And that is why the SDP strongly asks Singaporeans to consider its proposed non-open market norm flats to provide for the basic housing needs of our people. For those who can afford it, by all means, do aspire and seek to improve your wealth through wise investments. The norm flats are for basic public housing needs, not for speculation. If you want to speculate, save up first and speculate with funds that you can afford to put at greater risk. The norm flats are made affordable to house Singaporeans as land cost is not computed into the selling price, but on the condition that the flat can only be sold back to the HDB. Let's not exploit our own people to enrich the country's coffers. With less money wasted on highly priced HDB flats, there will now be more funds available to support our retirement. That is why the CPF should be all about. That is what the CPF should be all about. However, the CPF has lost its way. The government has lost its way. It is time for financial discipline. It is time to get back to basics. It is time to deliver on its missions. It is time to stick to the promise of returning our savings at 55. It is time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alfred, Wayin, and Brian. I'm now going to take some questions that perhaps first from the media over here. Do you have any questions, the media who are here with us?
Yes. So one question I have is that. Oh yes. Oh, sure. Okay. So one question I have is that MOM is increasing the wage cap for foreign PMETs. This is said to level the playing ground for the local PMETs, so that more local PMETs will be preferred. But based on what STPs are suggesting in terms of leveling the ground in terms of the score point system, do you think this wage cap would actually work in any way?
I'll take that question. So first of all, I think raising the wage cap is something that's relatively straightforward. It's probably a good thing, but I think it doesn't go far enough. And you know, with inflation, wages are going up across the board. And companies have found all kinds of ways to get around the wage cap. In terms of reducing bonuses, the fact that they don't have to deal with, for Singaporean men going on reservist training. So I think that, you know, it's yet another of these piecemeal measures which is taken, which doesn't really deal with the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue, as Wayin pointed out, is we are open to talent. We're open to genuine talent, people who can make a contribution to Singapore, who are willing to share their talent, actually, to train up younger Singaporeans to contribute to society and to the economy. But we don't want people who are brought in just because they're willing to work at lower wages. And unfortunately, that seems to be the pattern here. And that's the whole point of what we're trying to say. Yes. One more question from the media?
Just ask about
Sorry, can you use the mic?
I'd like to ask about the current, the epidemic going on. So how do you think it will affect the plans for the election? I mean, in your field, I mean, and then how will it affect the chances for the opposition with this kind of atmosphere going on, like a lot of fear?
This forum is primarily a budget forum. I did a session on the epidemic, and I think the reality is that we don't really know how the epidemic is going to turn out. I've gone on record as an infectious disease specialist saying that I think the epidemic is going to end with the warm weather. But obviously, we cannot hold an election during an epidemic season when there are going to be large crowds and gatherings. So the short answer is we don't know, and I think nobody really knows the answer to that. Another question from TOC.
This is not all for the presentation, right? So because I think this question deserves to be an end part, which is, see, this is definitely an election budget because they have to hold the election by next April. So with that, right, do you think that this current budget is generous enough to attract voters to vote for the incumbent?
Well, it looks, I mean, on surface, it looks really attractive. I mean, I've spoken to people on the ground, they were saying, but actually, if you actually take a closer look and you compare against the previous budgets, the goodies they hand out is just a matter of renaming them, rehashing, just minor tweaks here and there, right? But they do not address the fundamental issues that actually concern us all, right? For example, the cost of living, they have not come out with, they just push GST back right after the elections, and they're still going to continue with it, increasing to 9%. And if you buy the justification given by DPM Heng, he said that it's, you still have to get it because of future needs and all that. But then again, we have already had so much surplus, as I pointed out, even after deducting, they said they're going to incur a 10.9 million deficit this year, right? Even so, if you take off from the 2016, 2017, 2018, the collective accumulation of all the budget of 19.1 surplus, we still have a cool 8.2 billion left. Not forgetting that we still have a huge reserve, which is probably in the trillions, right? So I don't think it has addressed the fundamental. Whereas our plan, we are making the bold moves here. We are, it is in our manifesto. We think that let's not come at all these short-term solutions and not to address a long-term issue, right? Paul, you anything?
Yeah, every time I turn on the TV, I see this advertisement about how the budget is so good for us and it's going to give us $300, which somebody calculated works out to about 80 cents a day. And as Brian said, that's not actually a huge amount of money. A lot of people are not going to be unhappy about getting $300, but still, I wonder whether the government is giving themselves some wiggle room as well, because they said there may be additional measures which are thrown in as well. And the reality is they've got huge surpluses that they've built up from what some people have called austerity measures from 2015 all the way up to 2019. So they have plenty of room to throw money at the problem. But what we feel that needs to be done is not just throwing money at the problem, but addressing the fundamental issues of how our economy is structured, how our people are given the freedom to be creative, innovative, and to really maximize our potential as a people in Singapore.
On that point, on the point of the returns of the reserve, every year they say that Temasek is coming, Temasek and all the other GLCs actually bringing up the money. But given that, if you consider the combined asset of the MAS, the Temasek Holding and GIC, right? We are talking about in the amount of $1.3 trillion. So if we were to look at in terms of the returns every year from the NIRC, right? Would SDP think that the amount is actually quite insignificant compared to what it should have been? Because recently Norway reported a sovereign fund of how many percent? I think 10, 20%, 30% in terms of the return. So in terms of that, in comparison with what we have, would you think that it's actually a bit low on the low side?
It's certainly, if you were to look at returns on a fund on that particular annual basis, it looks low. But how NIRC works is that they stretch it over a longer period of time to even out, by smoothing it out, the actual potential cannot be seen. It is not known to us what its actual returns are, and having smoothed it out, I believe the NIRC could be relied upon as a constant contributor for our expenditure. Unlike what has been tried to be sold to us, that such one-off contribution should not be relied upon. But the NIRC has already been smoothed out for a 20-year period. Thanks.
I think for the reserve issue, I think the bigger issue at play here is the opacity of the funds and assets that we actually hold. I think it would benefit tremendously to know exactly. Maybe you don't declare to the public, but at least the lawmakers should know what is available where and how much return are we actually generating in order to have better planning for budgets return in terms of even NRIC or budget to be included into future spending. So The other point I would like to make is also about the appropriate talent to helm these companies. Okay, we all know that SMRT went on a global hunt and end up with a general, Singaporean general back in the CEO position. So for our national reserves as an investment company, shouldn't we have someone who has a global outlook on financial matters, from the banking sector, from the private sector, rather than someone who is a close member of the government? To be in charge. I mean, that is something that we all feel that there should be more transparency, and also the correct people should be nominated to run the sector.
So I'm going to take a couple of questions from the viewers who have given comments on our Facebook. There have been various opinions. One person actually asked this question. William Lowe, he said, one of my many worries is Singapore extreme high medical costs. And two people supported that comment. I think that's a very real issue. And I think of all the parties, the SDP has the most comprehensive medical plan or healthcare plan which deals with this issue of medical costs. Don't get us wrong. Singapore has some of the world's best doctors, nurses, and allied health professionals. We have tremendous resources. We have very great infrastructure. The trouble is that the financing is all messed up. We have MediSave, MediShield Life, MediFund, and those only account for less than 15% of total healthcare expenditure. Where does the rest of healthcare expenditure come from? It comes from government subsidies, it comes from employer-funded healthcare, and it comes from out-of-pocket payments. And the last two are escalating at extremely high rates. And that's partly because the healthcare system, in terms of financing, is a very hodgepodge system. What we need is a single, simplified, single-payer system, which is what the SDP has proposed. And that actually is going to end up saving money. We've seen this in many other countries. Countries like the United States, which have a system which is even more complicated than ours, they spend millions more of dollars on healthcare, and they get really not great results. Compared to other countries, like the Scandinavian countries, which have much lower administrative costs, and they get really good results. So that's what we're talking about here. We're moving away from a US-style system where it's free for all, where everybody is, just making profits as much as they can out of healthcare, to a system which is a single-payer, universal healthcare. Everybody has access to care at the point at which they need it. Looking at the other questions. Yes, there's a number of questions about the reserves, and I think Wayin has addressed this as well. And I think it's kind of ironic because we heard a minister just recently saying that people who hoard are actually not very clever, to put it politely. So I think all of us know that the reserves are really important because they are there for a rainy day. And what the SDP is not asking for, we're not asking for tapping the reserves. What we're doing is we're looking at the NIIRC, which is the returns on the investments. We're asking, number one, for transparency so that we know where the money comes from, where it's going to, what are the returns that the people of Singapore are getting from our hard-earned money. Singapore has no natural resources. Where did the reserves come from? The reserves came from our parents, our grandparents, the hard work of our parents and our grandparents. They put it in there so that we could save for a rainy day. See, and what we are saying is that, currently the figure is 50% of the NIIRC. If you just raise that to 60% or 75%, we're not even saying touch the reserves. We're saying touch the returns on the reserves and not even touch all of it. Touch 3/4 of the returns on the reserves. And we don't need to raise the GST. The amount of money that's brought in from there is way more than enough to cover the additional cost of spending that might come up in whatever scenarios that they may play out. So I'd just like to ask the rest of the panel. Let me see if there's any other questions. Yeah, another question was about food and beverage vouchers to $50 per Singaporean to boost domestic spending in the F&B industry. Any comments? I think it's a stimulus, I guess. But I think part of the thing about these vouchers is that the administrative costs are very high. It's so much simpler just to say, okay, look, we're not going to charge GST on rice. Everybody has to eat rice, right? It's a staple food for all Asians. So I personally am not a great fan of vouchers, and I don't think anyone else in the panel is. So last round, any comments from anyone else?
I think one thing I would like to add is that in the budget, DPM Heng actually states that we will be getting some kind of cash, in the coming months. But I always feel that this is a problem of an election year. They give you $200, $300, $100 every year, regardless whether you need it or not. And it is just baffling to me that why are they giving someone who owns a Ferrari or Lamborghini $100? It is really no point. We should actually spend this money wisely into the policies that actually help lower income people who can do more with this amount of money. So we really need to have a critical rethink of how we manage our finances in Singapore. So we really have to come up with more bold plans rather than temporary stopgap measures that the government has come up with.
Terry? Okay, it's totally dominating this question and answer session. Okay.
Okay. One is towards Wayne, right? So you mentioned that like in Australia, people are happy to do blue collar jobs, waitering and cleaner jobs, etc., because they are paid a living wage. But would it be purely a living wage issue for Singaporeans, given that there might be stigmas attached to the jobs, given so many years? Yeah.
I think it all depends. Like what I mentioned, the salary that is paid. Okay, for example, there is an official job in Australia which is called the traffic controller. Many people call them the lollipop man. So essentially, what they do is that they hold a stop sign and that redirect traffic at construction areas. So for that job, they are being paid 5,000 Aussie dollars per month. Just for doing that, redirecting traffic, 5,000 Aussie dollars per month. And with that income, they are able to live a dignified life. You see, they do not need to depend on anyone. They can. Their salary is comparable to some white collar workers who works in the office. And regarding what you mentioned about stigma, I think that there's no shame in doing all these jobs. For the longest period of time, people has been saying, only people who has failed will become taxi drivers. But that is not true. To be very frank, I have a lot of friends who are taxi drivers, and now the Grab drivers, Uber drivers is everywhere. Okay, maybe not Uber, but the Gojek drivers are everywhere. So I don't see any stigma in doing this sort of work. And in fact, it is decent, honest work. And I don't think there will be any issue as long as we do not flood these industries with low-paying jobs from foreign workers, low-paid foreign workers. That is, I think, the main point.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, you see, basically when you don't have a minimum wage, then essentially you're exploiting the foreign worker. See, the foreign worker comes here, he spends 5 years, 10 years working at really terrible wages under terrible conditions just so that he can bring back some money home for his family. And that's not fair to him or her either. See, I think if we had a minimum wage like they have in most developed countries in the world, that hasn't caused unemployment. It's actually raised the standard. And what it does is it puts money in the pocket of the worker. When you put money in the pocket of the worker, what are they going to do? They're going to spend the money locally. They're going to go to their local shop, they're going to buy something there, they're going to go to the local restaurant or coffee shop and spend money there, and the money gets circulated within the community. It doesn't go to the Cayman Islands or some, offshore tax haven, like what would happen if you give a tax cut to some billionaire, see? So that's essentially what we're talking about. Okay, your last question.
Yes, my last question. Actually, someone asked in the SDP stream. It's about the rental flats. So
yeah.
recently, right, there was a story about a single parent who was unable to get, was unsuccessful in the application for rental flat because her pay is actually above the ceiling of 1,005. But she complains saying that how can one family survive with 1,005, especially if she has 2 kids. So what's SDP view in terms of the rental flats issues? Like whether is it single parents or is it a full family, given that there's a 1,005 income ceiling or arbitrary ceiling to say.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, you see, our concept is that HDB flats are supposed to be public housing. Public housing is meant for people to have a roof over their heads when they need one. So this is the whole point of the NOM flats, which Alfred talked about earlier, which is in our housing policy. These flats should be kept as low cost as possible. They should be sold at cost. You know, many years ago, the National Development Minister, Teh Chang Wan, was challenged as to what was the actual cost of building a HDB flat. And frankly, he didn't give a very comprehensive answer. But I think people have done their calculations. If you exclude the cost of land, because the government acquires land at really no cost whatsoever, hardly any cost at all. And then what happens is they price in the cost of land, and then they price the cost plus in terms of the construction costs. And that results in the flats being grossly overpriced. You know, nowhere in the world do people buy public housing for $1 million or $500,000, you know, straight off from the bat, or resale at $1 million. You know, this is truly uniquely Singapore PAP kind of experience. But I think the reality is that public housing should be public housing. And what you correctly pointed out is this cliff effect. You know, once you set a threshold at 1,500, if you got 1,510, then you're off. You don't qualify. So these kind of things are what happens when you have a mindless bureaucracy that sets arbitrary limits and prices so-called public housing way out of reach of the average individual. So I think that's what the SDP's housing policy is all about, is to go back, you know, this non-open market flats, to have them primarily targeted at young families who get additional subsidies, to make sure that they have a roof over their heads so they can concentrate on building their families, building their career, and building the nation. So I think on that note, we thank you all for your questions. We thank the viewers for their comments. And we have come to the end of this SDP Budget Forum. Thank you very much. We'll see you at the next one. Thank you. Good night.